So in this slideshow, we are talking about not display type, but effective text type. So this is all, when we're talking about like paragraph copy or body copy that's smaller. So the text type, or also known as the body copy, is the bulk of the type we read. You know, you encounter it in books and magazines, newspapers, but to ensure good readability, the body copy should be set with special attention to tracking, leading, and word spacing. So a good typeface is an appropriate typeface. You want to really think about your body copy type being easily readable and appropriate to what you are doing. So the best typography is the type you don't even have to think about, or that you don't even realize you're reading it. So the three characteristics that define appropriate text for typefaces is it's easy to read, it's set with an even texture, and it's lighter in color. So if readers have to make an effort to read the copy, they're not going to read it. So we want legibility, which is the function of the typeface design and how easy it is to distinguish one letter from another in a particular typeface. And we also want readability, and that's dependent upon how the typeface is used and how easily words, phrases, and blocks of copy can be read. So legibility, that refers to the clarity, like how well one letter is distinguished from another. Like if we look at these two examples, the top is very legible. The bottom, not so much. I mean, the N could be a Z. You know, the G is not quite, noticeable as a G. So clean, consistent, and uncomplicated design features make it easier to distinguish one letter from another. Legibility in text depends on several factors. Stroke contrast, which you want medium, is the best. It's the easiest to read. Medium X height. You don't want quirky typefaces, so regular forms. You want the height to the width ratio to work, so you want that to meet in the middle too. And the counter and stroke ratio, you want medium there as well. So if we look at these examples, legibility in text depends on these factors. So here is the stroke contrast. So here we have stronger contrast. We have really thin to really thick. So here we have a more medium contrast, which makes it a lot more legible. Here the X heights are a little taller. And here, they're a lot smaller. So the medium X height works better. And having regular forms, this quirky typeface would be fine for a display head where it's a lot bigger, but for body copy, you want a regular form. And then the height to width ratio, you want, the right side is a lot more legible because it's a medium. Here we have much more elongated letters. It makes them look a lot more compressed and closer together, even though they may not be. And so you want that to be a lot more legible. Here, the counter and stroke ratio, if we look at the right side, the counter in the O and the width and stroke of the letter itself work a lot better than the tiny counter in the middle here of the G compared to the really thick stroke of the letter. So what makes a typeface legible? Big features and restrained design characteristics. So if we look at these typefaces, you can see these are the typefaces, and here they are down here, and we can see their X heights down at the bottom. So the Saban, the Plantain, the Caslon, the Baskersville, they all have nice open characters. We have ample lowercase x heights in all of these. Some are a little smaller than the others, so Baskerville is a little bit smaller. Here we see the same thing. The Avenir and the Future and the Gill Sands are going to have shorter x heights, but the Avant-Garde, the Franklin Gothic, the Universe, Those are a little bit more, have ample lowercase x heights there as well. But these are all very legible features. These, are not so legible features. These are a little bit harder to read, especially as lowercase letters in terms of legibility. And this one is even harder to read. We have barely any definitive counter here. In the A, we don't have a counter at all, really. But you want easy to recognize character shapes. And you want to make sure that the letters are easy to recognize too. Here in the example we have an A kind of going into a D, but in the middle here it's harder to tell, with the stem here getting longer and then a little bit longer and a little bit longer. It's hard to define if this is supposed to be an A or a D. So it needs to be easy to recognize. So we also have restrained design characteristics for legibility. So it's not excessively light or bold. It has very subtle weight changes in the stroke. So in all of these examples, we see that, and they're much more easy to read. So when considering the legibility of a typeface, the thickness or the weight of the stroke should be examined. So if we look at the top example here, the typeface is too light and has diminished the legibility. So light typefaces cannot be easily distinguished from their background sometimes. So while a typeface that's too heavy has a tendency to lose its pattern of counterforms. So weight can be used advantageously to provide contrast and clarity between typographic page elements such as titles, headlines, subheads, and deckheads. So a heavier or lighter weight can emphasize one piece of information over another. So that therefore makes the information more comprehensible. When we use extreme thick and thin strokes within letters of a particular typeface, that makes reading more difficult. So that prevents smooth transition from one word or group of words to the next. Thin strokes are less visible, creating confusion with letters of similar shape. So when a typeface that has extreme contrast between thick and thin strokes, and it's used in a text setting, it kind of creates a dazzle or sparkle effect that's created. So the reader begins to have difficulty distinguishing the words, and then the legibility decreases significantly. And the shape and the size of a page or column can influence that selection of character width. So for example, a condensed typeface like we have here at the top might be selected for a narrow page or a column, achieving more of a proportional, harmonious, and adequate number of characters and words to the line. The width of the letters is also important for legibility. So generally, a wide type is more difficult to read. A narrower letter changes the form or counterform of the relationship, causing letters to have an extreme vertical posture that can alter eye movement and reading patterns and diminish legibility. When we talk about readability, we're referring to how letters interact to compose words, sentences, or paragraphs. And that depends on a few factors which you have complete control over. And that's letter spacing, which is medium, is best. If we look at these, we'll look at some examples in a second. Leading or line spacing. The case, upper and lower case is best, especially for body copy. And layout. So if we look at the Scala, we have some different font styles here. Here in the top left, we have the spacing appears uneven. So we have this big gap between the T and the A. And we have a really close between the T and the W here. And if we add kerning to this, we can kind of even out the spacing. We can bring these two characters closer together and make it a little bit more even. If we use the italic version of this character type or typeface. And we suppress the kerning. We have no kerning. There's gaps between the L and the Y here naturally. So if we adjust the kerning there, it's a little bit closer together. Here, the V and the E and the two T's, it looks a little mismatched in terms of the whole word. But if we adjust the kerning, it adds for a more even appearance. So if we look at this word right here, rub, the gap here between the U and the B is much more between the R and the U. So you have to mind the gap, especially at larger sizes. So you want to make sure you adjust that through your kerning or tracking. Same here with these words. This is more along the tracking. We're adjusting the space between the characters of the entire word. So here where it's all even, you can tell like it makes the word look even more spread out. Here we have slightly uneven spacing between the words, but it looks a little bit more evened out when we adjust that to work effectively. And you can see where in some cases it works to bring them all closer together. Or too close can be a bad thing as well. So just kind of look for a balance there with a medium amount of space. And sometimes this is done intentionally for the sake of the brand and its personality. So if we look at Crate and Barrel, we see a very close typeface with very little space in between. But West Elm, which is a furniture and decor company as well, they have a much more spaced out letter forms for their brand. But if you look at their products, they're very airy and light and sort of this earthy and global kind of look to them, and it fits the brand. But too much or too little space between letters and words destroy the normal texture intended by a typeface designer. So even as you're reading this sentence, notice the narrow letter word spacing causes words to merge together visually. And likewise, the extreme wide letter spacing of this sentence is also disruptive for the reader. And leading matters as well. If we look up in the top left here, we have it set solid, which is 9 points in size and 9 points in leading. So it's kind of harder to read. It looks very compressed. So if we change the leading to 11 points and even to 13 points, the readability gets easier and easier. But if you have a larger typeface, like if we change the type size to 11, like in the right column over here, this is 9 points. So we reduce the amount of leading by 2 points. And you can see it's very compressed. The descenders and ascenders are overlapping. The leading's too tight. So if we have it set solid in this case, it works a little more effectively. If we adjust the leading and loosen it even more, even by 2 points, it's easier to read. The length of your lines also matter with readability. So an appropriate line length is essential for achieving a pleasant reading rhythm. So you want to allow the reader to relax and concentrate on the content of the words. So overly short or long lines will tire a reader. This long right here is almost exhausting. So, excess energy is expended when reading long lines, and it's difficult to find the next line when you come back over to the left side of the column. The short column or a short column measures, and it requires the eye to change lines too often, and then there's an inadequate supply of horizontal perceptual cues. So you don't want things to be too narrow as well. So an appropriate line length is essential for achieving a pleasant reading rhythm. You want to be able to see, in this case, you can see the top two are pretty long. The leading helps in the second example, but if we shorten it about 2/3 or a third of the way of the width, you can see this is much more manageable. It's easy to find the second line. It's more tangible. So when written language is captured in a visual and spatial form, permanent and concrete, so as the art of visual language, typography is inherently communicative. So a word said in lowercase is more distinct than a word said in all capitals because it's irregular and the word shape makes it more recognizable. So if we set a text in entirely all caps, it suffers a loss of legibility and severely inhibits reading. So you never want to use all caps in body copy at all. The reader is, not provided with the necessary visual cues that make the words recognizable. In other words, all the letters start to kind of look the same. And how we read, a lot of times we're not reading individual characters, we're reading the shape of the word. And so if you look at just the bottom half of this line, it's hard to decipher what these words say based on the bottom half or the half of the X height. But if we look at the upper half, we can read these a little bit more. So the shape of the upper half of the letters contribute most to legibility. So if we look, if we were assigning these characters here, which obviously you can kind of figure out who these are, if we use all the same, all cap, it just looks like rectangles in every single one. There's no differentiation based on who they are at all. And just the shape of the words in general look like a rectangle. But if we change it to upper lowercase, that changes things, and it's more legible and easy to read. And of course, if we adjust the typeface to kind of work with the personality, it reads even better. So continuous text type that's too large or too small will tire the reader. In print, the optimum size for text type is between 9 and 11 points for body copy. On a screen, like a website or a mobile app, we want between 15 and 17 pixels for an optimum size of text type. This happens because of the different X heights of the typefaces. And also the typefaces with relatively large X heights, that's going to improve readability. Smaller type with more space between lines is often more readable than a larger setting with tight space. With italic and oblique type font styles, similar to other situations where type forms deviate from a reader's expectation, italics impede reading. And it can add clutter to the text. An extreme italic slant can slow the reading process and is disliked by many readers. However, italic type can be very effective when used as a mean of providing emphasis. So that contrast in the angle of the character can create that point of interest. A true italic typeface is not merely Roman characters slanted to the right, but it's specifically created to be a companion to the Roman. So these words are set in italic. If a Roman type is simply slanted as above, it is referred to as oblique. When we outline type, we want to limit the use of outlines in text. What it does is it breaks down the geometry of the font and it makes it harder to read. The arrangement of text in the columns with flush or ragged edges is called alignment. Justified type makes the most of efficient use of space, and it also creates a clean figural shape. So you also end up with ugly gaps, rivers of white space, but however, it can open up as the lines are forced into even length. So with justified type, you'll end up with irregular spaces in between words and characters that you have to balance out. Whereas with just left alignment, you can just work with the rag line to make it work for your space that you're putting it in. So if we flush left or ragged right text, the left edge is hard and the right edge is soft. So word spaces do not fluctuate, so there are never big holes inside the lines of text. So the designer has to control the appearance of the rag. So a good rag looks pleasantly uneven with no lines that are excessively long or short. Nor should the rag begin to form regular shapes like wedges or moons. So you want the edge, the rag line, to be kind of uniform. You don't want a really long line and then a really short line. When you're flushing right, that's considered pretty awkward for long bodies of text because it forces the reader's eye to find a new position at the start of each line. When it's used in small blocks, flushing right can form effective marginal notes or sidebars and pull quotes. Centered text can be uneven on both sides, formal and symmetrical. Centered type is often used on invitations, title pages, certificates, and gravestones. And then you have random text that has no rules. Too much typeset randomly can be difficult to read and distract from the message. So a runaround type, obviously as the name suggests, that's type that surrounds an image or a display initial or even an empty space. So here we see where the type is taking shape of an object that's a recognizable silhouette of a circle, a ball or a light bulb or whatever kind of geometric shape, for example. If readability is not a first priority, then this setting can be employed. But try to keep your type evenly spaced. Holes and uneven spacing can be distracting, and it'll minimize the effectiveness of the intended shape. Here we have it contouring to a shape along the edge. Oops. So widows and orphans. So this is just Latin gibberish and placeholder text. But if you look at the top, we have the good and the bad is at the bottom. So if you look at the bad down here, this one single word at the bottom of a paragraph, that's what we call a widow. So you want to avoid that. So up at the top of here, you can see this works much better, not having the single word. Now, an orphan is when we have one line that carries over into the next column or paragraph, or not paragraph, but next column. We want to avoid that as well. So we want to either bring over another line or try and make it room for it in the previous column.